Hi, welcome to Brooklyn's Members TV and Podcasts. I'm Steve Clarke, and I'm joined today by the author and motorsport journalist Sam Smith. Sam, welcome. It's good to have you with us today.
Absolute pleasure, Steve. Looking forward to having a chat with you today about all things
Wonderful.
Formula E.
Yeah, now we're here to talk about your fascinating new book, Formula E, Racing for the Future, published by Evro. But before we discuss the book, Sam, your background.
Yeah, I've worked in racing actually for just over 30 years. I started very young when I was 14 as a work experience lad for
Wow.
a Formula 3000 team back in the days of Damon Hill and Alan McNish and that sort of crowd in Formula 3000. So yeah, from then on, I've worked for Lola Cars, which I worked for a decade as their communications manager. I've always sort of freelanced as a journalist, as well as doing the PR and marketing stuff as well. But since leaving Lola, when Lola ceased to operate in 2012, I formed my own business, which is kind of part PR, part journalism. And I've worked for Autosport, motorsport.com, magazines like Race Car Engineering, and also Motorsport Actual in Germany. And I've also been the press conference host for World Endurance Championship races and various other things, and have followed Formula E since the start as a freelancer, and now work for the race.com, which is a relatively new media. So yeah, that's most of what I've done. I've also looked after a few drivers and worked with drivers as well, doing PR and various other duties. So yeah, nothing if not varied, Steve.
Yeah, indeed. Did you have any engineering background, or did you just kind of pitch in at the deep end on some of these things?
No, Mike. Those who know me would laugh at any suggestion that I am an engineer or know anything about it. To be honest, I picked up the basics working for Lola, of course, and working for a few teams. I know what a 7-post rig is. I generally know how suspension works and how powertrains or engines function and gearboxes and so forth. But certainly not to the level of a lot of my colleagues and friends in the industry. However, for this book in particular, I had to dig deep and obviously understand a lot of the interesting technology involved in all electric powertrains, which was fascinating, particularly the battery side of things as well. So, yeah, going back to my work experience days, no, the mechanics in their own way made sure that they knew that I didn't know much about the technical side of racing.
Kept you well out of the way.
Yes.
Good. So, a fairly typical question, Sam. Why the book? How did it all start?
Yeah, well, there's nothing of its kind really. Formula E is relatively new. It was formed in 2014. That was when its first season was. So it's less than a decade old, and it's grown very quickly. Lots of manufacturers have come into the championship, and there's been a surge in interest in all electric motorsport. I think certainly in the last decade or so. So I really wanted to chronicle the political, the sporting, the technical machinations of this really interesting championship. It's quite divisive as well. I'm quite aware that a lot of people don't give electric motorsport much of a chance or much kudos. But in a way, racing is racing. If you've got quick cars and you've got interesting cars, then I think there's a story to tell. And certainly Formula E, starting from the ground up as a true startup championship and getting full FIA World Championship status within the first 7 seasons of its existence, there's a fascinating story to tell. So I wanted to make sure that it was that it catered for new and old, and I don't mean that age-wise. I mean that in people coming to motorsport fairly fresh in the last few years and following Formula E, because there are plenty of them. But also, I wanted to get across the context that this is like any other race championship in the sense that it is a single-seater championship. Yes, it looks very different. The hardware looks very different, and it goes very differently. But ultimately, it is a top-notch championship, extremely competitive, and one which manufacturers are very attracted to. So there's a whole range. When you look at the book, it's broken down into various sort of stages. But ultimately, what I wanted to get was a really strong narrative through the book, as well as some of the technical evidencing of what these engineers and what these drivers do and go through to be competitive.
Yeah. You rightly said the books are in different sections, and I have to say, I found each and every one of them pretty compelling reading. Majority of the time, I had no idea of some of the complex and some of the political background, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a moment. But how did you go about compiling the book in the first place?
Yeah, so yeah, I had actually written a couple of books, but a long time ago, and they were more like season review books, so fairly simple in terms of the format. For something like this, which is so rich in the context of how and why it came about, and then how it was sustained, how it nearly died, because it nearly did, which is we'll come on to, which is a fascinating part of the story, the Formula E story. What I really wanted to get across was, and actually how to purport it was that they this started from absolutely zero. You know, there was nothing. There was no precedent for, yes, electric cars have been around for a long, long time, but not in a concentrated, organized series. And what I wanted to get across was how and why it was born, which was essentially the meeting of a couple of minds, which was President Jean Todt, President of the FIA, and Alejandro Agag, who was this fascinating political stroke sports promoter stroke entrepreneur, who was a very charismatic guy who got the thing off the ground. But then, you know, when you read the book, you'll get an understanding of that there was a lot of naysayers and there was a lot of doubters. And, you know, I was one of them initially. I think getting something like this internationally off the ground is not the work of a moment, and many have failed. You know, I think a lot of people remember A1GP and Super Formula and the like.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing for me, Sam, is that when you think of the longitude, if that's the right word, of Formula One worldwide and how it's progressed over umpteen years, and yet this is 4 or 5 years old, and it's already so well established in terms of how it's structured.
Yeah,
Incredible rise, really.
it is. And, you know, some of that is by design and some of it is by happy accident. I mean, when you look at when it took off in terms of when it crossed over into really the manufacturer's consciousness, when they got attracted to it and they came in and brought, you know, let's not beat around the bush. They bring in a lot of money to the championship, sure, because they're marketing their technology to their future consumers. So I think it was around 2016, 2017. And when I mentioned happy accidents, you know, it wasn't happy for the manufacturers involved, but we had the Dieselgate scandal, which obviously scuppered a lot of, or fair few manufacturers' plans in motorsport and the automotive industry, obviously. And there had to be a change, even if it was just what people call marketing or perception. And that fell into Formula E's hands quite nicely. And they capitalized, and Mercedes, Audi, and Porsche all came into the championship, and BMW also. They all came into the championship. So you had this quartet of German giants coming into the championship, which already had Jaguar, which has got a very strong, as we know, great heritage in racing, dating back to the D types and so forth at Le Mans. So you had a nice mix of manufacturers. You had new startup manufacturers, like ones that many people haven't heard of, like NIO, which is a Chinese EV manufacturer, very ambitious and wanting to evidence its technology and its capabilities through Formula E. But what had to be running through the middle of this as a foundation was one that had to have stability and a strong roadmap, a strong technical roadmap. And initially, Formula E was going to be a completely open championship. But I think Agag and his advisors realized that just wasn't feasible in the first year or the first couple of years. But what they did is in the second season, which was 2015, 2016, they opened up the powertrain cluster. So the manufacturers and the teams could form their own gearbox, their own inverters, their own motor, old motors. You could have a dual motor in those days, and they could have that as a running R&D with the spec battery and the spec battery. And once that developed and evolved, their manufacturers became more interested because they wanted to put their own brand and stamp on their technology, on their all-electric technology. So there's a deep fascination there. They needed that strong foundation. That they got it with the FIA, who had some very clever minds working in their alternative energies division, which is run by a guy called Professor Burkhard Gerschel, who used to work for BMW and various other big manufacturers and OEMs. So it was a nice structure. But of course, in motorsport, what we know is when you get, traditionally, when you get manufacturers together competing, they often eat themselves whole, don't they? We've seen it in Group C days, we've seen it in ITC, we've seen it in Formula One, in World Endurance Championship, and that had to be covered off. And they've got a strict roadmap. They're going to have cost capping, which is going to come in, which I think was needed even pre-pandemic days. So, there is a very tight structure to Formula E, which I think has contributed to it sort of thriving and surviving as it has done these years.
If we just go back, I say the early days, it's kind of strange to think like that, but just talk us through the concept of how it came apart very briefly, and then the first couple of seasons of what was learned and how it progressed.
Well, what was great for me as an author for this story was that there's a romantic version of this. And, I'm no Mills and Boon author, Steve, but it's not that romantic. It's the romantic version is that Jean Todt and Alejandro Agag were in a restaurant in Paris, having a dinner and talking about future possibilities in motorsport. And Jean Todt mentioned that he really wanted to have an all-electric single-seater championship, an international championship. And Agag's ears pricked up at this, and they jotted some basic points on a napkin in the restaurant. This napkin was then kept in the restaurant and framed and put on the wall, and it was almost an urban legend whether this thing actually existed. But I, being an inquisitive sort, I went to this restaurant in Paris and found it and photographed it, which is in the book. So I think it's been embellished a bit, this sort of fairy tale thing.
Well, but that's the way it goes, isn't it?
Yeah, it's certainly helped the legend of Formula E, which is great. But actually, in reality, what happened is this was always going to happen, and Todd had thought about it quite carefully. And I think in Agag, he knew he had the perfect promoter and the perfect person to take this on. And Agag being a serial entrepreneur who'd been involved in politics as an MEP and also in Queen's Park Rangers Football Club with Flavio Briatore and Bernie Eccleston a few years before, wanted a new challenge. And boy, was this a challenge, starting up an entire new international motorsport championship. As I said before, not an easy thing to do, but they did it. And from that point on in 2011, 12 and 13 was building it and building the team and the infrastructure, the hardware. Obviously, they needed investment, and they got that through a Spanish businessman called Enrique Banuelos, who invested in it initially. And then the championship was ready to go in September 2014.
When you say managing motorsport, I'm not sure it's any more difficult than trying to manage QPR, but
well, you can't get relegated in motorsport.
No, well, there is that to it. Absolutely. You've said earlier on that obviously the two early seasons started the development off, and the two cars and now the single car. That's obviously added a whole new dimension to the sport itself.
It was a key milestone. It absolutely was. And, some of the manufacturers went on record saying that they wouldn't come into Formula E until a single car could evidence that it could finish a race. And BMW were one of the leading proponents of that train of thought. And quite rightly, because as we know, with electric vehicles, that the key I suppose worry of consumers is anxiety rate. It's whether they can get to their destination. And when you look at the first 4 seasons of Formula E, they use 2 cars. Each driver used 2 cars. They come in, hop out, and get another car. Now, they made a bit of a competitive element of this. Obviously, it's almost like a mini sort of sprint. And look, they used to do something not dissimilar at Le Mans, didn't they, when they started the race sprinting over the track into the car and they're off. That element was, I think, once the novelty factor wore off from that, it started to get a little bit tired. And it was evident they had to go to this Generation 2 car, which would have better, more usable energy, and that they will be able to get a decent race range out of them, which is what we have now, which is the 45-minute plus one lap race, which is kind of the average for an international single-seater championship these days. And obviously that the manufacturers bought into that because it was relevant for what they were going to be designing and selling in their showrooms too. So yeah, an absolutely key part of Formula E's growth, the way it's grown up, was that transition from Gen 1 to Gen 2, quicker cars, and obviously able to do much more mileage.
I had the good fortune to interview Sam Bird. Clearly a lot of questions, although there was no activity in Formula E at the time because of the pandemic. The conversation was compare and contrast from his earlier career as a F1 test driver and Le Mans and various other things. But really, when you look at it, and I think you mentioned this in the book, that really Formula E saved his career.
Indeed, yeah, and he's not the only one. Sam's a really fascinating character. I mean, he's a tremendous race driver. B, he's a terrific guy, as I'm sure you found, Steve, when you had him on your show. Sam's an interesting one, but he is part of this generation who was unable to get a chance in Formula One. Certainly good enough to do a great job in Formula One, but just never got the chance, and was very close to quitting racing altogether. He did a season in sports cars in, I think, 2013, and didn't especially enjoy it or have much success. And he was on the cusp of becoming a personal trainer, and didn't have any money and was down in the dumps. And then he got this offer from Virgin Racing to come into Formula E, and he ran with it. He became an instant success. He's still the only driver to have won a race in every season in each of the 7 seasons. And he's had a bit of a dip recently, but he had a great start to this year when he joined Jaguar, because he'd done all the previous seasons and races with the Virgin team, Envision Virgin team. And Sam, I think, is a really good example of a driver who was able to resurrect a professional career on the back of a future relevant series like Formula E, because there's no way that he could have gone back again to GP2 or to another single-seater championship. It was either sports cars or it was Formula E. I mean, in Sam's case, he did terrifically well in both, because he went on to drive for the AF Corsa Ferrari team at Le Mans in the WEC as well. So he's got a nice extension to his career out of it, but fully deserved, because
I said to him, how quickly can you switch between driving a Ferrari at Le Mans and Formula E? Said 1 lap and I'm back in the zone. So I actually first met him. He drove a Surtees TS 14 to 15 at the Rob Walker Centenary when he drove down Dorking High Street, making as much noise and as loud as he possibly could. And when he stopped, I said to him, you couldn't wipe the smile off your face. So but a lovely guy. Anyway, there's a lot more about Sam in the book that comes through. Now, you also said, and this is true about electric vehicles in general. I mean, I'm going through the process of buying one at the moment, and of course, everyone you speak to either completely blackballs you or says, you're mad or something, and such like. And the first thing that everyone says, well, you won't be able to drive far. Yeah, okay, that's fair comment, but Formula E itself has had quite a few critics, hasn't it?
Yeah, as I said at the start, Steve, it does have its critics, it has its skeptics, and I think it's kind of natural in a way when you get such new technology. And the thing, though, having said that, the thing that amazes me sometimes is, fellow colleagues in the media or people I just know in and around the industry sort of poo-poo it quite instantly without actually giving it a chance, or going to a race, or, going to the trouble of watching and understanding what it's about. I think it is different. It could be described as an acquired taste. There are things that are very different. So the obvious one being, there is very little noise. But I always say to people, well, I remember being a kid at Brands Hatch in the 1980s, going to watch turbo cars around Brands, which was a hell of an experience if you ever saw those things,
Yeah.
driven by Senna or Mansell or Prost, often described as the halcyon days of racing. But, what I remember about that era too is the sort of very faint popping and slight buzzing of the wastegates, and there wasn't a tremendous amount of noise. But I don't remember anyone really going on it about it then. You had this fabulous period afterwards of the Atmo cars, which were terrifically noisy. V10s, V12s, and look, I love a V12 Matra, or I love a sound of a Judd V10 or a Lola T70 as much as anybody. But to me, what I love about racing is the variety. I love one weekend watching a WEC race or an F1 race, or watching a historic meeting. But I also think that racing is always about, not always, but it should, large part of it should be about the future. And if we start looking back all the time, we just become, there's not really much progressiveness, is there? And it's not a healthy place to be, I don't think.
No, but I also think there is some fear as well about, if you admit to yourself that this could be some part of the future, I think people are a little bit, they steer away from it because, one, they don't want to understand it, or they don't want to accept that there's something out there that's alternative.
Yeah, possibly. I'm not sure. Like I said, I went to the first race, and I sat in the grandstand for free practice, and I thought it was a bit rudimentary. It was kind of national level setup. I thought, well, what am I doing here? This isn't. In fact, the cars, frankly, were slow. I mean, the Gen 1 cars were not even on the pace of a sort of Formula Renault. They were pretty slow.
Right, yeah.
But of course, when you spoke to the drivers and you took the trouble to speak to the engineers and the teams, and you saw the potential, and you realised actually, when you get drivers like Sam Bird, or you get drivers like Lucas Di Grassi, or Andre Lotterer is a very good example. Lotterer has won 3 Le Mans. He's done everything there is to do in racing, apart from F1, although he did have that one start for Caterham, that cameo. But he is the professional's professional, hard as nails racer, loves his historic racing, he's got an Audi Quattro Group B rally car, and loves all that sort of thing, what you call a sort of meat and veg racer. And he's told me after 3 races in Formula E, this was the hardest championship he'd ever been involved in.
Wow.
Not just purely the racing, but what he had to do in the cockpit. These guys are racing, don't forget, on street tracks. Yes, they're not going as quick as F1 or as sports cars, but they're going quick enough, and they have so much information to take in, and then to digest, and then to relay. They're relaying energy figures back to their engineer, and often they're doing it in crypto. So they've got crypto codes so that other people don't listen in and realize
and understand what's going on. Yeah, which is fascinating. Just jumping back to the book, Sam, did you find it easy? Well, easy is not the word, but did you find it fairly straightforward to get so much detail? And I have to say, the book is just packed with detail.
It was a challenge. Yeah, these things are. I mean, they're complicated. The cars are so technically they're complicated in the sense that you have a lot of software. Okay, which is like a bit of a dark art. I suppose it's the equivalent of aerodynamics in Formula One. What you've got to realise with Formula E is, although the car looks a little bit otherworldly, a little bit different, it's kind of half single-seater, half prototype. It's the Gen 2 car. Actually, it's reasonably simple. A lot of it is the bodywork, and there is very little aerodynamics in the traditional sense. It's very little downforce on these cars, and there doesn't need to be. It just needs to be reasonably efficient. The real efficiency and the real interest technically comes from the powertrain, and it comes from the battery. And the spec battery is provided by 2 companies, produced by a company called Ativa, which is based in San Francisco, and the actual management and the supply of the batteries and the maintenance of the batteries is by McLaren Applied, which is a part, obviously, of the McLaren group, and that is a spec unit. Now, obviously, these batteries are pretty heavy. So, you have a car which is a good 250 kilos, probably more, I think, heavier than an F1 car. So you've got heavier cars with less downforce, but the challenge in racing these cars for a driver is in the efficiency of how they drive the cars, the thermal efficiency, as well as how they use the software in the cars. The brake-by-wire systems they have on the cars, which are pretty complex too, not complex in their design, but complex in how they use them,
Yeah.
and they have to regenerate the energy as well. So the drivers have got a hell of a lot to do in the car, all in 45 minutes, all with 23 other cars, going crazy around them.
Yeah.
And you have to, you've got things like the attack mode where you've got to take 2 attack modes. Well, you can take more. It's up to the FIA. They don't get those attack mode details on how many applications or activations they're going to use until an hour before the race. So, formulating a strategy is not easy in Formula E. And, you only get a certain amount of usable energy that you have to use. And as we've seen, we saw on one occasion in Valencia, if a mistake is made, not a mistake, but a miscalculation by a race control, let's say, you can end up with, a third of the grid not making it to the flag.
The end of it,
yeah. Which is a whole
not really what you want, is it?
No, it's not.
So, what about the future, Sam? 2022 and beyond. How do you see things progressing?
Yeah, very interesting. So I think in a sense, technologically, especially with the battery, the world's their oyster, really, in terms of what is possible. I think they've got to balance it with what I mentioned before, which is this very structured roadmap, technological roadmap, which they have to keep in check for the health of the championship. And they've got to make sure that the manufacturers don't come in and just throw a load of money in it and it becomes a massive arms race, because that's how championships die, And you've got to keep it relevant to the people who are interested in the racing and the consumers who are going to be buying all electric cars in the future. So I think the battery is the component which is going to be the real interesting one if they free that up so manufacturers can develop that. I kind of hope they don't for a while, because again, that could release all kinds of mayhem into the budgetary what they've got to spend in it, essentially, the manufacturers. I think the racing will be good. The Gen 3 car will be seen probably later this year, and we'll start testing next year, and will come on stream for the 22-23 season. That'll run for 4 seasons, and then it will go up and up. Eventually, the all electric cars will, because they'll get lighter and because they'll get more powerful, will get closer and closer to F1 pace. They're a good, Monaco this year, they ran on the same circuit, and there was a good 26, 27 seconds between them. That's a lot over a 2.5 mile circuit. But I think the key thing for Formula E is going to be where they're going to race, because they're bringing the racing to the city centre tracks at the moment. A good 75% of Formula E races in any given calendar is on a street track. Now, that may have to change, because the quicker the cars get, the bigger the safety question becomes. Because racing, as we've seen in some IndyCar races and in Formula One, if 2 cars touch that are single seaters, they need room to dissipate the energy, and there's all those safety questions. What I can see happening is more and more circuits coming in, potentially like the Excel Arena one, which is going to host the return of the London E-Prix at the end of July. And that is going to be a part racing in an arena and part outside. And the same with Seoul in South Korea, is going to race in and around the 1988 Olympic Stadium. And in Cape Town, they've got a football stadium where they're going to do the same. And of course, those perimeter roads and there's more freedom of that area rather than a genuine city centre street track means that there's less disruption to the city centre, its traffic and its inhabitants. So it's a real balancing act how they do it. I think a calendar mixed with some of those races and some of the other, maybe 1 or 2 permanent tracks, is the perfect kind of calendar. But, the next calendar is going to be announced on the 9th of July after the FIA World Motorsport Council session. So we'll see what it entails, but for sure there's going to be new races in Vancouver and Cape Town, and the London E-Prix I think has got a nice secure future at XL. So lots to look forward to.
Can you see any other manufacturers coming into it, Sam?
Yes, I can. Yeah, Formula E often say to me, "Oh, we've got a subs bench full of 3 or 4 manufacturers, able to replace those that leave." And manufacturers always will leave.
Yeah, sure.
I don't think Formula E should take it personally that Audi and BMW have left. They've done it for their own reasons.
Yeah.
And the strength in depth of how many Formula E have in terms of the manufacturers is healthy and will be for years to come. New manufacturers, yes, Formula E, as I said, they say they've got quite a few. I'm not sure that's completely true. I think there's possibly 2 or 3 that could come in. I did a story today, in fact, about a little known manufacturer, but one that's coming up, an all-electric manufacturer called Lucid Motors, which is actually the same company I mentioned before, Ativa, who did the batteries, who are looking to come in for season 10 in a few years' time. There's been murmurings and mentions of Hyundai, of Alfa Romeo potentially, and the big ones such as GM or Honda, or who else could we look at? Honda, GM, potentially are 2 big ones that could come in the future. And all their automotive and all their corporate messaging they're putting out is all about all electric vehicles, because their projections show that that's what people are going to be driving in 10 to 15 years time, if not sooner.
I have to say that finally, Sam, I found the technology part of the book absolutely fascinating, because there are areas that I had no idea, and where the innovation has gone I thought was particularly well documented in the book. And if anyone's got any passing interest in knowing what's packed into those cars, it makes just a fascinating read. I think the other thing for me, now I understand more about what sits underneath these cars and how they're designed, makes the racing a whole lot more enjoyable. And you talking about the fact these guys are computing stuff every moment of their race and relaying that back, I find absolutely incredible.
It is. And, the more, actually, I think Formula E is quite rewarding in the sense that the more you get into it, the more you understand and the more you kind of interact with it. And what I mean by that is that, the New York E-Prix is on the, I think it's the 12th, 13th of July. And I'm going over there for that. What I'd say to people who haven't seen Formula E, or, have got a slight prejudice towards it, which I fully understand, is give it a chance. Watch it, embrace it for what it is. It's not Le Mans, it's not Formula.
No, good. It is Formula E.
Yeah, it's a new entity. But for instance, if you can download an app on your phone which gives you instant access to the driver radio. Right. So in race, you can listen to any radio in Formula E. And obviously, you can only listen to one at a time. But if you dip in and out of it, for instance, a great example was last time out in Puebla, the last E-Prix a couple of weeks ago, Pascal Wehrlein, ex of Sauber, Formula One parish, and DTM, of course, DTM champion. He's driving for Porsche. He's racing for the Works Porsche team, and he won the race, but got disqualified for a contentious technical infraction, and was notified as he crossed the checkered flag that he had not won the race. Now, not a great look for the championship, I don't think, that somebody can be disqualified immediately afterwards. But on the other hand, if I wasn't a journalist and if I wasn't imbued in Formula E, I could be listening to that, an immediate reaction to an emotional reaction, as you can imagine, from a driver who just had the win taken away from him. Wow. And it is just drama. It's something that I think new generations and new people coming to the race would think, oh, wow, that's amazing. The guy's just been through this emotional roller coaster. I'm listening to him being told this. So there are things like that. But like I said to you, Steve, at the end of the day, it is a race like any other race. Yeah. There is a standing start. There is a checkered flag. Yes, there are innovations, things going on in the race. Ultimately, it's who's going to get to the checkered flag. Racing, because they race hard. There's a lot of contact in this championship, but also, efficiency. Who can tame their usable energy and use it the best over a 45-minute period. And I think that's amazing. People, again, sorry to hark back to the turbo days, but I loved Formula One in those days. It was my childhood. And, one of the people who'd mastered turbos the best and was rewarded with it for countless Grand Prix victories and championships, but wasn't acknowledged as one of the most spectacular racers, that was the professor, was Alain Prost. And he is quite rightly held up as one of the greatest racing drivers that's ever lived. But of course, the ones who took the headlines were your Sennas and your Piquets and your Mansells for various, showbiz things that went on, which was great as well. But that always exists in racing. Le Mans, you've got to pace yourself. You've got to manage certain things. Formula E, you have to manage your energy, and it's every bit as, in my mind, it's every bit as skillful as going wheel to wheel with somebody else round a corner, which also happens as well. So, the detractors, I understand it, but give it a chance, see what you think, because I know friends of mine who have not traditionally enjoyed motorsport, but they will gladly now give it a go. Give it a go and watch 45 minutes.
Well, Sam, the book is absolutely fascinating. I highly recommend it to anyone who has a passing interest in Formula E, and also if they're fascinated by it, it makes equally good reading. So congratulations on a fantastic book. I hope it does well for you. What's next? Another book, or are you just carrying on your day job?
Well, thanks for nice words there, Steve. I'm glad you enjoyed it. It was great to write, and it's been well received. Yeah, so I'm covering Formula E this season. We've got New York, London, and Berlin double headers. So 6 races left, which takes us to August. I also work in the World Endurance Championship, so I'll be at Le Mans and the rounds there. More racing, but. I wouldn't call it a job. I never call this a job. Some fools pay me for doing this, and I gladly take it. But I do it for the love of it. So nice to share it with you.
Long may it continue, and hope you'll come back and see us again and report a bit later in the season on how the Formula E has gone. Sam Smith, thank you so much for your time, and good luck with the future book. Anyway,
thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.